I'd like to thank both of you for coming along and having a chat with me today. This is the Leon Drury podcast. And listeners, look, not that we have a lot of listeners, but I think they're high quality. And we encourage our listeners to subscribe and share this podcast. We're constantly talking to people who are involved in or participating in the manufacturing and engineering occupations and for the manufacturing industry in Australia. My primary focus is in New South Wales, but I've spoken to people all over the countryside. So maybe I'll get you to introduce yourselves initially. Eddie?
Yeah, Eddie Constable, co-founding director, WQMS.
Simon Charisma, same.
Short and sweet. I like people that are to the point. So we might start with just trying to get a bit of background on each of you to understand where you came from and perhaps why WQMS exists. Maybe we'll start with Eddie. Oh, Simon. Okay.
Simon will go first.
Okay.
I guess I'm the genesis of the story on the drive. I dragged him along.
all the way from the depths of 2012?
Yeah. Well, look,
before that, but yeah,
a little bit about me. So I'm a materials engineer by degree. That's not jeans and denim and stuff. That's actually talking about steel, metals, ceramics, polymers, the general sense of engineering materials. My first job coming out of university was with a little company called C.W. Pope, and they did inspection, testing, and they had a small department, a metallurgy department, doing failure analysis. So I spent 20 years in that company with various iterations.
And you're only 21.
Still look it. It's amazing. See, this is what industry is good for you, isn't it? Or all the chemicals or something. So doing failure analysis, I was working in the mining industry, so cut my teeth, in Singleton area doing inspection work on drag lines, shovels, drills, trucks, excavators, all those sorts of things, understanding the equipment. When you're doing the inspections, you're finding structural defects. It's part of routine maintenance to understand where is there cracking, because that's a potential problem if something breaks and it stops working. So then they could use that information to go away and do some planning. My ongoing job, after I'd got a feel for these things, was when stuff did go wrong. So doing the failure analysis to understand why things failed. So it's really cool. It's like CSI, but without a mystery black box. We're getting down to the root cause of why things happen and really understanding all the ins and outs and what causes it. Suffice to say, over 20 years, you see a lot of common themes and recurring patterns. And in 2011, I'd been working with some welding experts in the company at the time, because I think about the big picture. I'm a big picture guy. That's what comes out of all this. And trying to understand, well, they're doing this inspection and there's people doing the maintenance and the welding. Why is it all still cracking and breaking? Why is it all so bad? What's all going wrong about it? And it isn't getting better over time. It's maybe even going backwards over time. And so I wrote a paper which, it was the early days. I was just trying to crystallise a few thoughts and what could be done, because the maintenance industry and working in, the mining sector, it's a lot different than working in a workshop or a fabrication shop in Western Sydney or anywhere as it may be. And you have to take a different approach. So that was the start point. Anyway, we fast forward to 2018, and probably good to hand over to Eddie. He can join in this next bit of the story for where we start to go from there.
Yeah, so I guess start with my background. So boilermaker by trade, pretty well in the heavy mining industry. A bit of power generation stuff there too, mainly around boilers. But I come from, I guess, right from the start of my trade. I can look back now and I come from a time where training I call it the training done properly, but there was a lot of the funding for training then was readily available. So opportunities to undertake, nighttime courses and all this kind of stuff, training before leaving school, ultimately drove me towards wanting to become a boilermaker. So, focused a lot on heavy mining equipment repairs, got into a lot of dragline boom welding and upgrades during as a second year apprentice onwards, and then put towards a lot of all the, I guess, air quotes you call higher quality repair work. Yeah. So from that, I was selected to compete in World Skills. Competed a couple of different times representing Australia nationally. Done very well. Got exposure to some really, really good industry experts that you just can't go to any training organisation or most places in industry and find them people to teach you. So there's been estimated around 1,700 hours plus of additional hours gone into training in my own time throughout that journey, and that was over a nearly 4-year journey. So done really well there. Got a lot of good training out of that, and nothing comes of it if you don't practice. So that's what that was all about. And then from my mentors there, they were in the inspection game, and thought, I like what they're doing. They seem to have it pretty easy.
It's funny how the grass always looks greener.
Absolutely. In a sense that it was, but I'd always had a passion for metallurgy and knowing how and why things failed. That was the underlayer there. So went and done Cert 10, and I then ended up working for a company, Rio Tinto, coal and allied at the time, before within their organisation progressed to the engineering team, where I started working on how to improve all these problems that Simon was just talking about. How do we fix that? And coming from a practical sense, because a lot of it was, if they can't do it, then how do you get them to do it? You can throw a test at them, and you can repeat a test a number of different times, and you can either pass or fail, but the outcome in the end is never going to be fundamentally changed. So got inspired from a paper Simon wrote in 2012.
So you had an audience of at least one?
It was a presentation at the joint conference in Perth.
But it circulated quite rapidly, that paper, within industry, and a lot of people were talking about it.
Yep.
So particularly in the welding circle and engineering circle. So from there, was engaged there with Simon through a number of different failures on site, and of course, being curious around welding metallurgy. That was the number one person to pick their brains at the time, and from there we started. Well, I was working on a WQMS project at the time, coincidentally, and
pre the company,
and we collaborated. Sometimes after hours, we collaborated for a very long time. This is probably around 2016, 2017.
Yeah, so you went through this process.
So you weren't working for the same firm. It was just you knew each other through that paper, basically, that presentation.
Yeah, and then through the connection, and then as Eddie was involved in that project, essentially it's a passion project for me. I was just donating time and squirreling it away on other jobs and stuff because a lot of whiteboarding sessions down, and Eddie's putting what we're thinking was right at the time into practice.
So from an industry perspective, Ed, you're on the tools, right?
Yeah.
So do apprentices get taught the structure of metal and the basics of metallurgy and and things like that in their apprenticeship? And what sort of drives that for you when you make these sort of observations about the importance of it?
Yeah, there's a few key few key points there. One that stands out for me is that there wasn't much in the way of literature. Like when I think back to all the handouts and course materials that were given, it was more of the fact that at that time, throughout my apprenticeship, the head teacher, he had come from a background and was heavily involved and had a wealth of knowledge in that, that was then co-delivered on for whichever student was interested in picking that up. So his history and his knowledge really flowed through. So I guess firstly, the importance of having a teacher that understands and knows from a practical and industry, they've got to have industry experience. Yeah. That played a big driver in engaging me, because he's dealing with pressure equipment and things like that ultimately grabs a young person's interest at that point. From that, I got to do a lot of my pressure tickets I got them through the welding competitions. So from that, you ultimately go and do your theory behind that to get one of your pressure tickets, 1796 pressure tickets. And sitting that theory was also with the same head teacher at the time, and ultimately, delved deeper into that, into the metallurgy side. And once you started to practically get a sense of how things relate, that was the hook, I guess. Yeah. That's what dragged me in, when you can relate it to what you're doing in industry. So rather than just a lot of welders don't learn from the theory side. They actually have to hands-on do things and learn along the way that way. So, yeah.
So from a company perspective, what's the point of difference? What do you offer industry that no one else was offering?
Well, this comes back to the genesis of, we didn't quite finish that story, but how we started. But really it's a mission. So at that time, I guess we were both looking for changes and a bit more self-direction. We were aware of what wasn't working.
The shortfalls, yeah.
So, and to summarise this too, what's the difference in maintenance and fabrication welding? We've got one which is, in fabrication, we've got a good guide in 1554. It's a risk management tool, and it provides a very codified and set structure. So there's a strong compliance basis. In maintenance welding, we're a different objective. We're not trying to necessarily say, is it to the design specification, building from new? Is it an effective repair? Because what's the objective? They're not making a new truck, or they just need to keep that thing running safely and efficiently and effectively. If they're doing repeat repairs every month and those repairs are getting worse and worse, we have this snowballing effect, then things grow faster, and then you have a failure, and then that costs downtime. That's a problem. So you need an appropriate way to manage that. So we really started looking at what's the fundamentals behind all this? What are the basic principles? What we realised is to use the existing tools, it's like taking that same hammer and bashing everything with it. Yeah. Sometimes you need to pick up a different tool to get the job done. Yeah. There was no tool. There is no standard tool out there. In fact, there's a huge gap around everything around that sort of maintenance welding perspective. Is you're a boiler maker, go fix it. And there's a lack of understanding in industry about the technicalities behind it. It's like, as long as there was a crack and now there is no crack, then it must be good. And there's a host of things going on in there. So we essentially came together to go, there's got to be a better way. We didn't know it at the time what that way was, but we backed ourselves to figure it out, naively or not.
Yeah, we tried all the conventional ways. So through all that project that I'd been working on, putting a lot of people through welder qualification tests, standard base welder quals, as per 1554, and that just was not getting the tangible outcome of reduced cracking that we needed at the time. So very costly learning exercise, but it was one that was well and truly worthwhile learning, because fast forward and moving into this maintenance world of competency space, there's a lot of transferable skill sets for the whole of the maintenance industry.
I guess from the uninitiated, people who don't understand, the variety of work that a boilermaker, a fabricator would do, everything from, the light sheet to heavy fab. A lot of people who go through as boilies don't generally do geometric development and shaping and forming of metal in most cases once they've left the TAFE system.
Yep.
That the industry is sort of specialised the operations in such a way, and I think the maintenance welding component, a lot of people don't think about that. They think about, and even boilermaking in its title is, making, not fixing. And most people don't work on boilers anyway. So, and in this context, I think we're talking about things like cranes and diggers and all the different types of equipment.
In reality too. So there's clips go around on YouTube and LinkedIn of ships breaking in half. There's a massive industry in maintenance, welding, and that could be all the rail stock, trucks. Then you've got just structural maintenance at industrial plants and so on too.
Yeah, I've spoken to a lot of people in this regard.
Navy, military stuff as well.
Navy, and we're already preliminary starting to see a lot of issues in the wind industry, renewables industry also, fatigue cracking and things like that. So.
I've been involved in defence interest groups around and providing intelligence about skills for that group, and the procurement of a major piece of equipment, it has to be manufactured. So we've got a shipbuilding industry in South Australia. We did have Forjax up here in Newcastle. There was other shipbuilding yards in Western Australia and other places like that. But the money from an industry perspective isn't really in the manufacture of the original equipment.
Sustainability.
It's the sustainability.
And this is key,
Absolutely.
to even in any industry, the purchase of a new asset, what defines that? What limits its life? And it shouldn't be on a structural basis, unless things are,
grossly under
there might be some sort of design issue, but generally, it shouldn't be on a structural basis that says, oh no, we throw that away because it's just too hard to maintain.
Yeah. Well, a life of let's say a ship is about 40 years, 40 in service in the military. Same with a lot of the other pieces of equipment that they purchase because they're such high ticket items. We're about to procure submarines, hopefully, and the same sort of thing. And they got double hulls, so double the possible problems. And they're actually, when we were talking about the previous model of the submarine that we're purchasing from France, we're designing new materials, new types of steel to manufacture these things. So we're at the cutting edge, and we don't know what the fatigue problems might be that come along in the future with those. And
that's where you hit on a point too. So what is maintenance about? What's the drivers for it? And you've either got fatigue, so when cracking develops in where it shouldn't be cracking, it's not in the welds, it's quite often elsewhere propagating into the structure. Corrosion and wear are probably the main ones. And then some other sorts of things, you've got thermal degradation or creep or other types of issues. But typically, those are the three categories that you're going to be doing some sort of maintenance remediation work about. And unless you understand how that relates, then you're not going to effectively solve the problem either. And I mean, fatigue cracking is one which, I guess I'm a specialist in. And, a fundamental difference. Fabricating, to tease these apart, fabrication versus maintenance. In a controlled environment for fabrication, so generally, in a workshop, we've got pieces of material with prepared edges and you're putting it together, and we have a welding procedure which specifies exactly what, the run sequence and the joint. It's all uniform and parameters are there. A welder is qualified, which says he's or she's generally is able, demonstrated ability to follow that procedure. So we're stacking all the things up to say this should be a good outcome. We have a welding supervisor in place who makes sure it's the right welder doing the right work for the qualified and everything like that, doing the inspection process along the way. And at the end of it, you kick the tyres and inspect 0 to 10% because it should be all right because you've done all that up front. Depending upon your industry and what the nature of the equipment or plant is, generally, if it's field repairs in the mining sector or resources sector, you're a Boilermaker, go fix that. There's your list. So the technical instruction, the supervision, cracks have varying geometry. You've got to gouge that crack out or that defect out, grind it to the right shape, and then prepare it, and then deposit a sound weld. But you also then got to think about, as we discussed, the fatigue. And put it simply, big rigid structure. If I join two bits of plate, we all know that they bow upwards. So, you know, you can preset them or put strong backs on or whatever. We've got a big rigid structure in the field. Now, those plates bow upwards because the weld metal shrinks. In a rigid structure, that weld metal's still trying to pull together, but it can't go anywhere. So we generate massive residual stress. That drives fatigue. But no one does anything about that. So that's a key
because
part.
they can't see it.
They can't see it and they don't understand it and they're not taught about it.
Yeah.
So having this sort of basis, I mean, these are all the fundamentals. So between, you know, Eddie's practical expertise and, you know, field experience and know-how and, you know, I've got all the boffin, all the science and engineering behind it all, this sort of merger is really what makes WQMS unique and, different in that we can take this sort of fundamental viewpoint. It's not biased. It's not missing something. We've got a very rounded viewpoint to come up with, say, strip it all back. What are the fundamentals that are required? Essentially what we see is there's just a massive gap. So here we are trying to fill that need, that gap, to create something which is going to produce the outcomes required. So, I mean, just this morning, maintenance versus fab, for example, did a quick search on LinkedIn. I occasionally like to do this, just a finger on the pulse. And you have a look at all the trade, in the trade sector, in the mining resources sector, in maintenance, filter down through welders and Boilermakers. Simple stat, 75% of those jobs were maintenance. I mean, this is headline stuff. I didn't do a deep analysis. But 75%.
Yeah. But and if you look at the qualification itself, the standard, it purely looks at, you know, welding technique, particularly on a brand new piece of material, using good wire, good current, good system.
Perfect setup,
right? So, and it takes experience and time, and this is where constantly I'm trying to talk to people about, you know, the value proposition in someone going through their apprenticeship. So unfortunately, I've got a personal opinion about apprentices and whether someone should be an apprentice or not. In a lot of cases, I think a lot of the people who are enrolled as apprentices fabricators are actually welders. They are purely there welding. They're not actually fabricators because they don't actually shape or form metal. Mm-hmm. They don't loft. They don't mark out. They don't do any of that stuff. They get, you know, either pipe or plate, pre-formed, pre-shaped. They are welding it.
And that comes back down to the employer and what they're specialising in, really.
Yeah, and look, and this is where, you know, we get into some of the politics of it about, you know, the cost of training people versus the outcome that industry wants. I've talked to many people in industry about being careful about this prospect. Look, it's good for the individual who wants to get highly paid, and it attracts people into industry because, you know, over the last 10 to 15 years, the labour shortage has driven labour rates that are well above award rate, which is, you know, it's good and bad. It drives inflation, but it also, you know, creates a lifestyle.
It's a double-edged sword.
It is a double-edged sword, and we've seen it particularly in the mining sectors, both here in New South Wales and in WA and places like that. But, you know, we also struggle with completion rates from apprenticeships, and that's because apprentices get bored. They don't realise they don't see what they see in theory or in basic fundamentals in a training course aren't actually being practiced in the workplace that they're employed by. So that says to me that they actually aren't apprentices. They're not seeing the work that actually they are being trained for. And and even people who do come, because people used to go into steel manufacturing here at BHP in Newcastle, and they'd go around all the different sections, and they're really well exposed, and they got a lot of skill sets. But now a lot of these places that were born out of the closure of facilities like that are now specialists in their little piece, but they don't actually get that exposure any longer. So, group training could facilitate some of that training, but, I was mentioning to someone the other day that that trade particularly is what I'd call a Swiss Army knife. Okay, so you get all these specialist skills that went together. So when you had to do maintenance, had to service something, it's a bit like a vet. A vet has to learn the systems of birds, cats, dogs, cows, horses. They're all different, right? This is what a maintenance welder will see. So they'll see all different types of materials, all sorts of conditions, whether the material, we've had conversations before where, if you're trying to remove a crack, it's like being a dentist. You've got to get to the root of the problem, remove all the cancer.
And not make more of a problem.
Yeah. Yes. So, and this is where I think the exposure for someone who has come out of their time as an apprentice, so they might have done between 3 and 4 years, depending on when they were signed off, and their experience that they got when they were an apprentice. Then they have to go out into the field and practice their skills. And some will avoid work because they don't want to get that skill set. So I guess, and you're talking to a lot of employers, and particularly in the mining sector up here in the Upper Hunter, what are they telling you? What are they trying to solve for this issue?
I think you've got, while you think, Eddie.
Yeah.
My impression, everyone works within the standard paradigm that they've been given. So we have a vet system which we weren't really aware of, we're still thinking the same paradigm. It took us a while to sort of start to think differently and bigger as well. People are taught what they're taught, and they come through the system, and then you go, well, why can't they do what they need to do? So we tried to figure out what needed to be done and created a benchmark training and skill assessment in the mining welder competency around maintenance. That doesn't solve the problem, as you're addressing, though, around how do they get there and how do they get to that skill. And employers, though, they work with what they've got. They know the problems they have, not enough people, skills gap, can't get the outcome I want, but these are all just hard problems. What do?
People bury their head.
It's just the same. You just complain about it and you can't do. So the mines are aware of the importance from a maintenance perspective, but they've got their own problems in how they manage that work and so forth, and work with the tools. I say the tools, but essentially the skills of the tradesmen.
And there are the available tradesmen in the current climate, right? 100%. Because not everybody wants to work in this environment, and there is a labour shortage.
Yep, absolutely. I see people come and go all the time because it's not what they expected. So
yeah, and a lot of people have a perception that there is high salaries, and in some cases there are, but there are conditions that go along with those high salaries.
Yep.
Yeah.
But thinking back on a couple of the points that you made, you mentioned BHP.
Just going to turn the air conditioner down a little bit. Right. Freezing over here, mate.
From my perspective, what I've seen through my time, or what I've witnessed, is that generation of trades people. I label it as they were taught the right way. They were taught the right fundamentals, but you had a lot of them larger players like BHP. They had their training academy centre. You had a lot of, in that era, OEMs who also provided specialised training, and they also had their own welding workforce.
Yep.
So by the time they were finished, or them OEMs were moving state or moving out of Australia because that project or whatever was happening was wrapping up, you had that knowledge just floating around until they sort of went to different industries or different shops, or started their own little side gig, and it sort of distilled. I guess you'd say. So now, as the generations have gone on, that quality of trades I've seen have, either retired, unfortunately passed away, or in a completely different industry altogether.
Yep.
That knowledge has heavily dissipated.
Yep.
So I was very lucky to be in the start of that, or sort of mid to end of where all that was, that knowledge was disappearing. So got very lucky with being able to gather a lot of that good fundamental knowledge from all that older generation.
Yep.
Because a lot of that, what I've seen now, it's not taught.
Yeah, this is what we reckon, and it's an excellent point, is companies rely on contractor or service labour. It's not in-house.
Yep.
So there's not the same focus on development, training and so on. And a service provider, workers equals, hours equals money.
Yep.
And the people that could be on any different location on any different day. So the accountability from the asset owner, it's not, so yeah, these are all contributed to a big dilution in quality and training. And as you said, Eddie, too, because although some of it was taught, there was most of it, what is still currently picked up is informal learnings in the workshop. So if you happen to be in the right spot with the right other people to mentor and pass on the right information.
Or misinformation. There's a hell of a lot of
But
that.
I say the right information. I mean, yeah.
Alternate facts.
That's it. But what people believed at the time was right, yeah.
Yeah, and so because this is just an informal process, it's here we are now. But I mean, we didn't really have a conscious awareness that we just sort of started from a very technical basis of how do you get the outcome, and then we started to realise all these gaps, and then that's created a new mission from beyond. Like, surely, how do we improve or help industry get better outcomes and help manage all that process? So it's all stakeholders, it's important. It's got to be the people, it's got to be the companies they work for, it's got to be the asset owners, it's got to be sustainable.
So I guess going back to that question I asked a little while ago about employers and their view on this issue, do they realise how much it's costing them by not having these skills, and are they willing to participate and change this issue?
A lot of them, I guess you could say in this area, are at capacity.
Yep.
With what they can take in terms of work with the workforce they have.
Yeah.
A lot of them would obviously like, more welders because sites are screaming at them, supply more labour.
Yeah.
You see, I've seen some hesitance in and around some employers with wanting to upskill and further their workforce in and around, they're worried we could spend all this time and they'll just go up the road for another 20 or 50 or 80 cents more.
But don't they come to them in that circumstance as well?
Yeah, so there's some short-sightedness in all this, absolutely. And I love working with the employers that have a little bit more longer-term vision.
Yeah.
We need the right skills in industry. So, sure, they'll leave us. They've identified that they might go, and some of them actively encourage that.
Yep.
And I think that's a good idea too, because that's how you get well-versed.
Yeah, and I think
and experience.
As I mentioned earlier, I think group training could be a very good outcome for a lot of these apprentices to be able to move about companies and build out that, what I'd call that Swiss Army knife, so that then eventually when they found their niche, they could go back and focus on that. A lot of people focus on money, some focus on conditions, some focus on, they've got a family and a location that they want to live in. So all these things are considerations for someone. Not everybody's going to work saying, I want to do the best job I can do today.
No, there's certainly a fair few of them in the welding world.
When you come back to industry, the question around industry, are they aware of what it's costing them? And the short answer would be generally no.
It's not a key metric that's...
Well, they don't have the tools to measure it. So they can measure something basic in like, for company A, we're spending this much, and that's the type of services they do.
And that's how I used to track it.
But so there's just a measure there, but there's not an opportunity cost about what should it be, or is it, relative? And, on a shutdown, for example, so then it runs over by 2 weeks and it's like,
So there's no known preventative maintenance schedules to know when failures are predicted, and to say, well, we're actually overrunning these predictions and it's costing us money because we're
maybe
not
even that advanced. It comes down to the management of maintenance itself, to understand the nature of the repair that needs to be done, and then tracking the effectiveness. And what does that mean? It's to say, okay, I fixed that. How soon am I having to come back to that and fix it again? Yeah. And simply put, there's the data out there is in PDFs, which are then pieced together into spreadsheets, and there's just holes all through it. So there's a feel, there's gut feels. You try and get numbers, not so much. And even in where it is tracked quite well, you go, well, what could it be? Because, okay, it was repaired. Does that mean it was repaired properly? There's generally not any sort of post-analysis done. It's just like there's a crack. We need to get that thing operating again.
That's I guess, what I'm trying to say about the preventative maintenance model. If you do repair it, you'd expect there would be a life of that repair, predictably. If it's fixed properly, it should be as good, if not better than new. And then you'd expect a life cycle out of that before you'd have to repair it again.
And this is a top point that you're making. People's expectations. They become used to, we just fix that every 6 months.
Yeah.
How do you change that paradigm?
Yeah. So, and in the world of continuous improvement, look, I came out of the aerospace industry for a while, and we had, cycles of process improvement, which we'd expect that we'd increase cycles of QA or failure rates, So we'd do the analysis on how often we'd get a failure. Then you'd go to sampling. If you got a failure and you got a couple in, you'd go do root cause analysis, identify what that problem was, then start to build again your confidence in your process to say, my process is now correct. I'm happy with the processes that we've implemented, and now we can wait until we see another failure that we haven't been able to predict yet, and then go back and go through that process again.
I guess this is where we also need to point out differences between industries, where there's risk. And consequences. So, oil and gas, massive risk and consequences if something goes wrong. So there's a lot of emphasis on doing things right. Plus there's the compliance aspect. Aerospace, huge consequences if something goes wrong. Mining industry, generally lower consequences. It's downtime. It's lost production. It's not life and limb. It's
the
not
minerals are going to be there. The minerals are going to be there tomorrow,
it's
regardless.
not making headline news. So risk management, and this comes back to also, is it a crane? Okay, we need to be compliant. It's lifting heavy things. It's a safety risk versus effective repair outcome. It's not a simple blanket approach either. It's really got to be tailored to what's right at the time.
And I guess coming to now, and look, we do have a project underway, but we don't want to really touch on that today. But leading into that project, you were involved in some development of a couple of units. Can you tell us about how that sort of happened and what the outcomes were?
Yeah, that's a good lead in probably to, again, the rest about, so what we did from a company perspective. So from 2019, I think when we started, really stripping everything back, and we worked through to develop, and this is running through some pilot programs with some partner mine sites and other organisations, and eventually came up with the concept of what needs to be done as far as the training package, the knowledge part and the skills part, which is we became the Mining World of Competency System, and essentially that's turned into a 2-day-ish micro-credential, so a day of training and a day of assessment. And we did that very mindfully because it needed to be right for industry, sustainable, cost-effective, and designing it all right so it's scalable. So essentially we are the governing body for that. There's a very strict system around how it's delivered. A lot of data is gathered. We issue a certification and so on for that through the MWC portal. So it's been a heck of a lot of work to make this. It's like building a cruise liner. You can sell tickets, but it won't sail till it's built.
Yeah.
And we've built this really, it's a thing of beauty at the end of the day, which can provide to industry this simple benchmarking on competency in terms of he's a level 1, 2 or 3. They don't need to be welding experts to say this package of skills, how that relates to the nature of the work that needs to be done. Because most maintenance people, they're other trades or not at all. They don't know welding per se, and nor should they need to. So they can have confidence in who's coming to site, that there's a VOC, a safety VOC component, because...
What's a VOC?
Verification of competency is, in a safety sense, under WHS legislation, there's a requirement to say that anyone who works at your business is competent to perform the required tasks. Welding's a strange world. It's very strange in so many ways. But you can go through a trade, and because there's a lot of electives and choice and how that's built up in different RTOs and how that's designed and delivered, someone can come out and they might have only done gas metal arc welding, or, different combinations and different levels of ability. So they may have never touched a carbon arc gouger.
Yep.
So they're going to come to site, they're going to be asked to carbon arc gouge, do flux core, do oxy-fuel cutting. Now, all of these processes have different risks involved, and you have to know what to do so you're not going to potentially kill yourself or someone else. Yep. But we rely on a trade certificate, which actually may not cover any of that.
Yeah, and as I alluded to before, they might have learned the first principles of it in TAFE, but never actually touched it on the job.
As well. So,
Absolutely.
This is all this building in this mining welder competency. So that's been the journey in progress. And then, introducing this to industry as a tool so that it is portable between employers, so there's not this value loss and this fear of investment. But then we started to realise too that we can put people to this test. If they can't pass, what then?
Yeah.
And that was a real... that stuck on us for a bit. And we're like, what can you do about this? And then a
couple of companies in that time had engaged us to do a thorough...
Eddy to do coaching.
Yeah, but engaged us to do to dive down and see what the skill level actually was before we even started.
It's a funny thing. Years ago when I was working industrially, I used to go to a lot of shutdown plants, and you'd see people who would walk up, and if they weren't regular on shuts, they wanted to get in. They had to do a welding test, and that was sort of the measure of whether they were up to scratch. Because they'd have to go away and be tested, NDT or destructively tested to prove that they actually had the penetration and so on. Didn't necessarily always fill all the needs of the company, but
absolutely not.
It actually got people past the gate effectively.
It's still done.
Yeah.
Welder quals are the hammer. They're part of this proverbial hammer that's just used, but maintenance is more than just welding. Yeah,
but the point that I was trying to make was the black art of welding. You can hold a competency, and you could have got it 20 or 30 years ago.
It's true.
And may have never picked up a welder since, but you still hold that competency.
Hey, that trade certificate,
A trade certificate. And more than any other trade that I know of, if you haven't got flight time, you're not familiar with the equipment, not familiar with the processes, and the standards that are today, it can be a real challenge for you.
Absolutely. I see that heavily in off the topic of mining, but I see that in the power generation at the moment, particularly in boilers. There's a very niche circle of people that can actually do it. Tube work, very niche. No one's teaching that. There's no training courses where you can go and become a boiler tube welder.
Yeah, and part of that's been because the workforce has been stable for so long.
Yep.
So there hasn't been that demand. And from my perspective of what I do on a day-to-day basis, talking to the state government about funding qualifications and courses, and piloting, different sort of methodologies to try and capture this issue. Like I said, I came from the aerospace industry. When the A380 first came out, it was the first, I think one of the first of the full composite fuselage aircraft, and the maintenance periods grew exponentially, and they don't know when they're going to fail. So one day we might hear of a plane falling out of the sky because it failed, and we didn't know that it was going to fail. Whereas a lot of the metal technologies that we had around different types of alloys and that, we knew what their fatigue factors were and failure rates were, so preventative maintenance went in place. But this is something that we're having to deal with now, where we've got a workforce that might have worked in a power station for the last 30 years. They're now about to retire or whatever. What are we going to do to fill that gap? And the public system around funding the training and the development of the standard that is required for today's technology. You mentioned wind turbines before. A lot of that stuff's there's a plan for the Newcastle offshore wind plant. There's going to be other types of technologies. I expect that, we won't be too far into the future of going nuclear, possibly. Once we get submarines on our shore, I think it's a fairly slippery slope that could happen about power generation. And that means nuclearising our trades to be able to work in those industries and deal with all the factors that come along with that technology. So, it's a hard one for us to tackle as far as a thin market, because the workforce isn't that large, and there's been a big push away from people who've worked in traditional power plants that is basically steam generation on the basis of burning coal and creating steam. A lot of people don't understand that it's really still a steam plant. Yeah. Whether it's nuclear or coal, it's still a steam plant.
Yeah.
You only do a weld so perfect, and then it's just different materials in nuclear. There's some pretty cool exotic materials, and they are different to weld. To tie this back, though, to say, this training piece, this is what we saw. You could throw a test at people, whether it's a welder qualification or we're doing this skill set, this mining welder competency. How do you get them there? And then we're invited, what's the name of the industry skills?
ISGR.
Reference group.
Yep.
Yeah.
So invited there by Peter Schreiner.
So Peter Schreiner is one of the peak TAFE people for New South Wales TAFE.
Yep. Yeah, so we went poking around back then in and around what units you could piece together in the maintenance space.
Weren't in that space at all, in vet training at all.
Yeah. But, we asked, started looking at it and what there was, and very, very quickly learnt that there wasn't much.
We started to understand why the gap existed in terms of here's what we're asking to do and why they can't, and that started to become clear. So
it must be interesting for you, Ed, because having experienced weld skills, which is the pinnacle for trade training, and experienced, not every apprentice in this trade has gone through that level of training.
I never appreciated that at the time either. It's only looking back on it. In
a lot of ways, and don't take this the wrong way because I don't want you to get a big head, but you're the rock star of the trade in the sense that, you were an Olympian competing at the highest level of skill in your occupation. And a lot of people in general public don't know about that.
No, absolutely. You've hit a nail on the head, and something that I kind of did want to talk about at some point was in and around that. I had a very niche experience and learning opportunity, and I really, looking back on it, I really did grasp that with all I could. And in hindsight, I'm quite glad that I didn't end up going international, because I would not know near anything of what I know now. So there's some really good hindsights from that. But I guess the passion. There's a passion there. You've labelled. You've said there that niche skill set. So that's one of the key drivers for myself to still be involved with weld skills now. So I've been doing that for quite some time. My previous mentor, who's not just long passed away, John Anderson, had very early got me involved after all them competitions in training camps, developing, running skills development, New South Wales skills development training camps at TAFE New South Wales Fund. They were, week-long training camps. Now, unfortunately, due to funding cut and we do a weekend.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that's still important that I see, that I try and pass on a lot of the knowledge and tips and tricks and shortcuts. I say shortcuts, but the shortcuts to learning outcomes. It may take someone, 2,000 hours worth of practice, where, with what I've learned, you can get them there in 100 hours worth of practice. So
can you bottle that and put it into the current training system?
That's what that's the mining welder competency and all the coaching that I've been doing.
Yeah. And you've got to be careful with that prospect, because some people think you can treat your stuff overnight. And
absolutely, yep.
Yeah.
That is
this is a two sides of the thing.
Yep.
There's training. The training in whatever space, the funding won't be there, and the model and demand, unless there's demand for it.
Yeah.
It's a two-side marketplace.
Of course.
So you need to create industry wanting it and having a benchmark and saying this is what we need, and then the vet sector or private sector, it could equally be private, if there's demand for it and there's value perceived in it, and that's really the key part. Is like, and to tie this in, this expertise, like how do you take someone to the next level, or give them cross sec, from fab to maintenance.
You spark one thing there, Simon. What I've very quickly realised over the last 10 years anyhow, is when I'm out and about, and a lot of employers see what you're able to do and show people, and they automatically think that, geez, he can do it, why can't anyone else do it? But they don't see how many hundreds to thousands of hours of practice achieving that.
I don't know if you've ever read or know of Malcolm Gladwell, and I'm trying to think of the name of the book now, Outliers it was called, and he gave a number of examples of people who were seen as experts in their fields, and talking about someone like the Beatles, for instance. Now they were playing 10 hours a day, 7 days a week in Germany, long before they were sort of
got their name. Yeah.
And there's and even talking about someone like Bill Gates, who was down the road from a university when computers were first invented, basically, and he was given time on a computer and was there every minute of his waking hours outside of his other learning, and it's about that passion and that application, and there's that 10,000 hour rule, that if you apply yourself for 10,000 hours, you'll master the skill, whatever it might be.
I'll disagree.
Yeah, okay.
There's plenty of 20-year tradesmen who are still as crap on 20 years down the track as they were on the first day.
Did they have the
passion? Did they have the interest and the motivation? So that's really the key. And the 10,000 hours, if you're starting from scratch and you don't have, if you've got to figure it out for yourself, 10,000 hours, sure. Just got to put in the effort to get the muscle memory. But if you can have expert coaching and opportunity, at 10,000 hours, as Eddie said, might be cut way, way down. And that's, the whole 10,000 hour thing is actually, I think explained in the book, is fairly well misunderstood.
Yeah.
But there is...
I simplified it a bit.
To put the guts of it in, unless you got the drive and you actually do the work, you won't get to where you can be, and you can shortcut that process if you can stand on the shoulders of giants, and have that expert coaching and mentoring.
And that's where I think, one of the things that was key, and I'd be interested in about your experience, not I'm trying to exclude you at all, but just talking about the experience of on the job, what was your mentor like on the job when you were an apprentice?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Did you have one? Or
I did. Yeah, I had originally. So I first started off as the head teacher here at Muswellbrook TAFE. His name's Gareth Lloyd. Give him a shout out. He obviously seen potential in a number of different apprentices, and he's really the genesis for throwing us in the ring for weld skills and competing against each other. So he was one of them. And then through that weld skills cycle, there was obviously my mentor, who was also another TAFE teacher at Tides Hill at the time, John Anderson, who I mentioned before. He he really become a close mate from that, and still up until I went and seen him in hospital till his last day, we were very close.
Yeah.
But throughout my time on the tools, I can think back to at least, probably less than 10 standout people that I really levitated towards and seen how they were doing things. Because one thing that I like to my training of teaching people now is, no matter how I try and do it, no matter how you try and do it, you have to find your own way.
Yeah.
However, there is a fundamental base set when it comes to welding parameters, and you can have some whatever garbage on welding procedure paper that someone's pieced together that doesn't understand it. There's certain parameter sets that you really can't go outside of.
Yeah.
It's that easy.
Yeah.
It's
Sweet
just,
spot on a tennis racket.
That's it. Yep, that's a good analogy.
It's the ping that you get
Ping
when you
versus
hit it
clunk.
right. Yeah.
That's it. But it's about trying to find someone's way of how to do it. It's, what works for me may not work for the next 3 people. And that was some of the things that I learned in from the mentors. And two I become very close mates with, 2 who I still consider extremely good tradespeople, extremely good welders, and no matter what you throw at them, they can just do it. They can pull the rabbit out of the hat. That's the type of mentors that I.
Because you're a mentor to others, right? So
yes.
How do you feel? Do you feel that you were adequately prepared to become a mentor?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Now you asked me 10 years ago. No, not a chance.
Yeah.
But understanding more about myself now and what I know and how to deliver that, becoming a good teacher does not happen overnight. And I'm still on that journey.
Yeah. We, MSA, are currently working on a project to try and attract, we're doing some research to attract people from industry to become vet teachers, right? And it's occurred to me in the last couple of months, we spent a lot of money on mentors for apprentices, but we haven't had mentors for mentors. And I'm wondering if there's an ability for us to be able to bottle that capability or put a training program together for supervisors, people who are in the workplace working with apprentices. Unfortunately, people get thrown together. It's a bit like some people get married to their wife on the basis of a barbecue they went to, and they just hit it off one day, and the way you go, you got kids. I think I've been thinking a bit more laterally about this in recent times, particularly about teachers, because I've seen some good teachers and I've seen some bad ones. I've experienced them myself, and trying to. Even for apprentices, there's been a bit of debate over the last few years about having, train others as a unit of competency in the training plan, saying that apprentices shouldn't be teaching anyone else. But one of the things that I know of, I've got a martial arts background as well, is the way you actually learn best is by teaching someone things that you know.
Absolutely, and getting dominated that way. I do jiu-jitsu, so the only way I learnt was. Someone showing you.
In every case, unless you can explain it to teach it, you don't understand it.
Well, it's the Feynman theory, the Feynman technique, right? So simplifying it to a standard that you can explain it to just about anybody.
That's mastery.
Yeah.
And that is what I've realised, in my journey too, is going through, I don't know, and then you learn and learn and learn and learn, and it becomes massively complex. And how you communicate is also massively complex because everything is all this. And there's a lot of engineers in this space, you might notice, in their communication. It takes a lot to simplify this down to the essence of it to be able to then communicate that too, because there's a lot of extraneous stuff. It's like, what actually makes a difference? It doesn't need to be perfect.
Yeah.
And that's the reality of our world, we live in it. But if you get some key points right, we're going to be on the best, we're going to be on the way to having a good outcome. Yeah. And that's for everything too. So
I'll place that question to you as well in your profession. Have you had mentors in your space that have sort of led you down this pathway?
I've had mentors, but that was in a sort of different phase of my career. So these are people, you provide the guidance and, there's a fella called Eddie Digby who would tell me to go away and have a think about it. And, I think I'd come back and do the research, and he put red line all through my report again. That made me infinitely better.
Yeah.
So to be challenged is one thing. I think in a different sense in welding, I mean, just to cross over between me and what other stuff we're talking about and tie that in, is there's teaching, mentoring. That's one part. Mentors are partly about role modelling. If you talk about a sport, we say coaches. So it's about how you do something and to be the best at what you do. The technique around it. And welding it's kind of like a sport. There's a muscle memory, hand-eye coordination that you've got to pull together, plus having the knowledge of what you're doing and why you're doing and when to do it and all that sort of stuff. So there's teaching and mentoring. I think there's this other space of coach, and that's probably what's missing, because you've got some bloody good people out there who could coach others, but they don't have the confidence, they don't have the know-how. It's like, how do you coach the coach or teach, give that coach, that person, the skill to coach, recognise them as a coach, so whatever business they're in, they can be adding value as long as their employer, gives them that opportunity.
Yeah. Okay. So we sort of started going down the track of how you got involved with sort of giving some input into the new units of competency and so on. I think we've sort of got to a point now where our next chapter, which I think we're in now, that I don't really want to explore right now until we've passed that point. We might come back at another time and review what we've done, what impact those units are having, and what the benefit has been, and if it's met your expectations, and the challenges and everything that came along with starting that pursuit, because it's quite interesting. I think there's huge opportunities in it. We've got a lot of challenges as well that I'm sure you'd agree. There's challenges constantly. I just, one of the other things that sort of has occurred to me through this interview, and just thinking, Boilermakers and engineers, how the hell is this working?
That's what makes us unique.
Yeah.
Secret sauce here.
Yeah.
It's the odd couple.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we've been going for about an hour. I'd really like to thank you for your openness and the discussion. I've enjoyed it. I hope it's something that you thought was worthwhile doing, and we might come back again in the future and continue the conversation. And discuss further what WQMS has in its future.
Absolutely, man. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
First podcast.
Oh, just before we go, how can people get in contact with you if they want to?
Sure. Find us on LinkedIn. So put a bit of media out there, or check out our website, wqms.com.au. See what we're about and all the other things we do. Apps and all sorts. Yeah. Basically, we're out there trying to add value to industry, solve all those little niggling problems, and just make things better.
And I'll add in the show notes those links as well, so anybody that wants to contact you, they can.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Excellent.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leon.
Bye-bye.